Hey guys, and welcome back. Today we are going to be talking about the very basics of heat embossing. So there's a couple different kinds of embossing powder, and these are just the basics. There's certainly variations of these, but there's of course the white and clear, and you can get these in regular or fine detail for fine detailed line stamps. There is also some metallic and some pearlescent embossing powders that will give you a little bit of a shine and a metallic look. And of course, there is embossing powder with glitter and shimmery things inside it. Now, all embossing powder really is little bits of plastic that melt when you add your heat gun to it. So we're going to go over some very basic techniques to get really good results with your heat embossing. So I'm going to start with the metallic, and this is the liquid platinum embossing powder by Ranger. And I feel like if you are a beginner with heat embossing, metallic or a pearlescent embossing powder is probably the best one to start off with. I like to catch any extra embossing powder into a coffee filter. They're very inexpensive and they work great. You will need an anti-static tool. This is just an anti-static bag. There are several tools on the market that I will link below. It's basically personal preference. And all this does is it gets rid of all of the oils or static that is on the paper before we do our heat embossing so that our embossing powder doesn't stick to areas we don't want it to. So I'm going to take out my very dirty Versamark ink pad and go ahead and stamp out this solid image. And I'm just using one of these solid images so that you can really see the results. Going to stamp that down, and remember from yesterday's video, this is just a clear sticky ink, so you're not really going to be able to see it too well on white paper. I'll go ahead and sprinkle on my metallic embossing powder, and again just catch any excess into my coffee filter, and you can see that it just stuck to the areas where I wanted it to. You can just tap off any excess if you have some kind of lingering around, and it should come right off. I can pour the remaining embossing powder right back in that jar, and you have very little waste. A little goes a long way. A jar of embossing powder will last you a very, very long time. Now, I use a Wagner heat gun, and I've had this one for a couple of years. I think it works great. You can certainly get any brand that you want, but you will want to flip this on and let it go for about 30 seconds or so before bringing it to the paper. It gets very hot, so watch your fingers, but the more heated up it is, the less warping you'll have to your paper. When you add heat to any kind of paper, it's going to warp it. So you want to make sure that you are adding as little heat as possible. So once I add that heat to this embossing powder, you can see that it's turning metallic. It's not that dull color anymore. And this is the reason why I say beginners should maybe start with a metallic, because it's easy to tell when it's done. When it's shiny and it looks metallic, it's done. Now, it does take a few minutes, or a few seconds, I should say, to cool down. So if you immediately touch it, that's what's going to happen. If you wait about 10 seconds or so, we're good to go. It is nice and cooled down, and it is not going to go anywhere. Now we're going to use this same embossing powder, same paper, same ink, same everything, but this time I'm going to skip the anti-static tool. So I'm not going to go over it with this anti-static bag. I'm going to kind of touch the paper like we normally do and go ahead and just immediately stamp the image out with my Versamark ink pad. Remember, I did not use an anti-static tool. Now when I sprinkle on the embossing powder, same way as I did before, you are going to notice that we have some stray pieces of embossing powder kind of sticking to areas we don't want it to. Even when I tap it off, it's still there. Now you can just brush this off with your hand, your fingers, or a dry paintbrush, whatever you prefer, but sometimes some of our images, we may not be able to get great results with that. So next I'm going to do some embossing on some darker cardstock. So I have a piece of black cardstock here, and the same way with inks as far as the opacity goes, it's going to be the same with embossing powder. Most embossing powder is opaque, meaning it's going to show up on darker colored cardstock. So once again, I treated that with my anti-static tool, stamped the image out with the Versamark ink, and I'm going to sprinkle on that metallic embossing powder. Now, I also have my heat gun heating up to the side. So once I start this whole process, I usually just flip on the switch on my heat gun. That way it's nice and heated up when I'm ready to start the embossing. Now you can see that my paper is powdery from my anti-static tool. And depending on which one you use, it could be very, very powdery and kind of toned down. So once the embossing powder has a few seconds to cool down, remember we don't want to touch it right away, you can either use a dry paper towel or you can use a microfiber cloth to just kind of sweep that away. Now here you can see I'm adding a whole bunch of heat. And I'm adding too much heat. I've already seen it turn. I know that it's done, but if you continue to heat, you can see that I kind of lose some of that metallic look. It's not quite as shiny. So you want to make sure that you're not overheating your embossing powder as well. And the metallics are very easy to tell when it's done. When it's shiny, it's done. So that's why, again, I say to start with the metallics and just be careful not to overheat. So I let that cool down. I'm just taking a dry paper towel here because I can't find my microfiber cloth anywhere, which does work better, by the way, but I can get rid of that powdery residue that we have on the card. So next we are going to stamp some white embossing powder, but this time I'm not going to be using the Versamark. I'm going to be using a pigment ink. So I'm going to bring out that unicorn white pigment ink that we showed in yesterday's video when we talked about inks, because remember, this is a slow drying ink. It kind of sits on top of the paper rather than soaking into it. So I'm going to tap my stamp right onto the ink pad. Remember, you don't want to press too hard with a pigment ink, and go ahead and stamp that down. Now I can bring out my white embossing powder, or really any color you want to use, and sprinkle that on, and you'll see that it only sticks to the area where I stamped out with that pigment ink. Once again, making sure that my heat gun is heated up, I can go ahead and heat emboss that. Now you can slightly see that turning. White is a little bit easier to see, but sometimes can be tricky depending on the type of cardstock or the color of cardstock that you're using. So for black embossing, I prefer, and this is personal preference, not to use black embossing powder. I find that even with an anti-static tool, it kind of gets in places I don't want it to be. And those black little specks in places that you don't want it to be can kind of not ruin your card, because there's no such thing as ruining anything handmade. But it won't give you the results you're looking for. So I prefer to use another kind of pigment ink and clear embossing powder. So I went ahead and treated that with my anti-static tool, and I'm going to stamp this with some VersaFine Onyx Black ink. This is a pigment ink. It dries a little bit faster than most pigment inks. It's considered a fast-drying pigment ink, but it doesn't dry immediately like a dye ink. So once again, I'll stamp that down, and this time I'm going to sprinkle on some clear embossing powder. Now you can get the ultra fine detail embossing powder, which will get into really fine lines, but in this case, this is a pretty solid image, so I'm not too concerned about using the detailed embossing powder. So this is another one you're going to be able to see pretty well, especially when you're using a dark colored pigment ink as your ink, which you stamp with. And once I heat this up, you'll see that it becomes nice and shiny and has that really bold black image to it. So once you become a little bit more comfortable with heat embossing, you can kind of experiment with different embossing powders. And for this one, I'm going to be using a glitter-based, or a glitter embossing powder, I should say. It just has glitter in it. It still has the little bits and pieces of plastic because that's what's actually going to melt. Glitter doesn't melt, but when the embossing powder melts, the glitter will kind of stay in place. So once again, treated that with my anti-static tool and stamping this out with Versamark ink. And you can see that my stamp was a little bit dirty, so I can see exactly where I stamped. And I'm going to be using this glitter embossing powder by Wow. Now you can see that it is super glittery and it is gorgeous, but the only difference with the glitter that I find, it's a little bit harder to tell when it's done. So the reason why I say is more experienced heat embossers, this will work great, is because you kind of know the timing. You roughly know how long it takes to melt embossing powder. Now you will see a little bit of a change, but it won't be as noticeable as I kind of work my way down this image. But once it is all done, it is solid. That glitter is not going to go anywhere. So finally, we are going to talk about warping as far as our paper goes. So I am going to take a piece of heavyweight white cardstock, and I have a piece of cardstock here, and this is just, I think it's a Michaels brand. It's a 65-pound cardstock, very, very lightweight. So I'm going to heat emboss the same way for both of these card panels. I'm going to treat them both with my anti-static tool and go ahead and stamp out the same image right in the center with the Versamark ink. I'm going to bring out some gold embossing powder. This is also by Ranger. And again, this is a metallic, so it's very easy to tell when it's done. And this time, I'm not going to heat up my heat gun. I am going to flip it on and bring it right to the paper. Now I am going to start with the heavyweight cardstock as far as the heat setting goes, because it can take a little bit more heat than the lightweight cardstock, but you definitely will notice a little bit of warping, especially when I put the paper down onto my work surface. You'll notice that it no longer lays completely flat. And you'll also notice that it's taking a little bit longer to actually heat set the embossing powder. It's just not heating up quite as fast. This one is because my heat gun has had a little bit of a chance to heat up a little bit from doing the first one, but you can see both of them are pretty warped. I'm going to add a little bit of heat to the back of the card panel to kind of even out the warping. And you can see that the white is actually laying a little bit more flat, but the lightweight cardstock is actually even more warped than it was before. So when you are heat embossing a larger piece of cardstock, I definitely recommend using a heavier weight cardstock. The 65-pound cardstock just is going to warp no matter how long you heat up your heat gun. So to really show how warped these panels really are, I'm going to adhere these down to a card base. This is where it gets a little bit tricky because it's not going to lay flat. I prefer to use wet glue, like I said in the first video for this series, because I have a little bit of time to work with it and I can kind of shift things around as I go. I'm going to start with this heavier weight cardstock, and I'm going to lay that right down onto my card base and kind of work my way around the edges to make sure that it is completely stuck. Now, it takes a couple of seconds because my paper is warped, but for the most part, I was able to get this to stick down. Now for this lighter weight cardstock, this is where I really struggled. So I am going to add the same amount of glue as I did for the first one. You don't want to add too much wet glue because you might be able to see it through the card panel, especially when you're using a really lightweight cardstock. But you'll see that as soon as I got one side to stick, the other side kept popping up. I just could not get this to lay flat. Number one, we added a whole lot of heat to it. Number two, we didn't heat up our heat gun first. And number three, it's a very lightweight cardstock. So you'll see that I really struggled with it and it's just not going to work the way I want it to. So finally, we are going to talk about the inks that work great for heat embossing. So the Distress inks and the Distress oxides, like we said in yesterday's video, are slower drying inks. Even the regular Distress inks, even though they are a dye ink, they dry a little bit slower. So they will take embossing powder. Of course, the Versamark or any other clear sticky ink. And we have the pigment inks. Now, you can certainly try it with dye inks, but you have to move very quickly and you probably won't get the best results in the world. So there is a quick look at the embossing for beginners. I do have another video that I did several months ago with all different heat embossing techniques if you are getting a little bit more comfortable with heat embossing, and I will link that below. Tomorrow's video, remember, is going to be on Amanda's channel from Rise and Procrastinate, and I will link her channel below. She is going to be covering all different techniques and tips and tricks regarding ink blending. So make sure you go check her out. So thank you guys so much for stopping by, and I will see you on Friday. Bye.